Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. And next up, we've got Tomas Hertl. The story of Hertl with the San Jose Sharks is rather well known at this point, but I will briefly go over it. Drafted back in 2012 by the San Jose Sharks in the first round, he would end up having an extremely strong start to his NHL career. Within just the first 3 games that he had played, he'd put up 6 goals, including a 4-goal performance against the New York Rangers. And while it would slow down a bit from there, he would still be having an extremely successful rookie campaign that would unfortunately be cut short due to a collision knee-on-knee with now hated former Los Angeles Kings forward Dustin Brown. And over the next couple of years, he would struggle to kind of find his footing in the NHL, never necessarily capturing that same magic that he had in his NHL debut, but eventually, a couple more years down the line, he would find himself a home as a strong center for the San Jose Sharks, really peaking in that 18-19 season, where even surrounded by some very, very good forwards like Joe Pavelski, Logan Couture, Timo Meier, he would emerge amongst all of them as the Sharks' best forward, in my opinion, of that season. But ever since then, it's kind of been a bit downhill for Tomas Hertl. Not necessarily that much of a surprise, because generally the Sharks have been going downhill since then, but a really good player will still manage to shine even on a really bad team. Just taking a look at Erik Karlsson from this past season or Timo Meier from these past 2 seasons, those 2 players have still managed to look exceptionally strong, even on a Sharks team that has been one of the worst in a very long time. But Hertl, on the other hand, his heart has never really been in it, and while his point totals haven't really suffered all that much, he's managed to maintain around a 0.8 points per game pace throughout each of these past few seasons. It doesn't necessarily have that same feel as it did back in 18-19, where you could really tell Hertl was at an absolute dominant form. And it's not as though that Hertl's decline can be explained away by age, as Hertl is still on the correct side of 30. He is still relatively young, and while he may be exiting his prime somewhat, you should still be expecting some good seasons from him. Now, at the end of this past year, or at the end of last season, so the 21-22 season, it was of course a contract year for Tomas Hertl, and the big question was whether or not the Sharks would want to trade him or whether or not they'd want to sign him. But this was still the old regime. While Doug Wilson had stepped down due to medical reason, it was still essentially his group of guys leading the San Jose Sharks, and one of their last moves as Sharks GM or Sharks runner of the team, or whatever you might want to call it, was actually signing an 8-year extension for Tomas Hertl instead of trading him away. And I, for one, believed that was the incorrect move. I thought they should trade Hertl, and this past season, the 22-23 year, was a very good indication for why that should have been the case. When you usually sign an 8-year deal for an unrestricted free agent, it is specifically designed so that you'll get very good value out of the first 4, 5, 6 years, but you'll likely not get particularly strong value out of those last couple of years. And you may think, well, why don't they then just sign them to a 5 or 6 year deal? Well, they don't really have that option, because every single team would be willing to give the maximum amount of years to a player who is good enough if the team that has them isn't really going to that extra mile. So for instance, the Sharks could go to Hertl and say, well, we think you're only going to be good for about 5 years, so we'll give you a 5-year contract. But there will be another team out there who says, you know what, we don't care if you're only going to be good for the first 5 years, we'll give you that 6th year. And then another team will say that they'd be giving the 7th year, and so your team as an option is to have that 8th year if you really want to go for it. So basically, when you have a really, really good unrestricted free agent, you're basically forced to give them that full contract. But it is viewed in this way where, yes, you're willing to accept those last couple of not so great years because you have those first few really good years and your team is looking to win now. But the Sharks, they aren't expected to win now. This first season of his contract, what is expected to be a very good year for Hertl, even though it technically wasn't, is now been burned because the Sharks have just been a bad team. And this upcoming season, 23-24, Hertl's 2nd year of his contract, the Sharks are again expected to be bad. And the year after that, maybe at best, the Sharks can actually be decent again in 24-25, but that's like the best case scenario. But realistically, will they be? I'm not entirely sure. That would then be 3 years burned off of Hertl's contract. And so if you're expecting that those first 3 years of the contract aren't particularly useful because the Sharks aren't going to be a good team, and then the last 2 or 3 years of his contract aren't going to be particularly good because he's going to be much older, you're only really getting 2 or 3 really good years out of an 8-year contract from Hertl, which just doesn't really make much sense. And even at the end of the day, Hertl's performances have not really necessarily been worth the over $8 million that the Sharks are paying him. And in particular this year, it does stand out in a pretty bad way. Taking a look at his statistics, 79 games played, 22 goals, 41 assists for 63 points. And you may look, 63 points, 79 games, while not necessarily $8 million worth, it's still pretty decent. But looking a bit deeper into these statistics, it doesn't really feel like he was super deserving of really having these 63 points. And he kind of rode on the coattails a bit of both Erik Karlsson and Timo Meier, who were just miles and miles better than Tomas Hertl, who is supposed to be one of the best players for the San Jose Sharks. You're expecting, when you're paying $8 million, while you're not necessarily getting the elite of the elite who are making like 10 million and putting up like 90 to 100 points, you should be at the very least coming close to that point per game pace. And if not, you should at the very least be playing in such a way that you expect to get really good value. But neither of those things have actually been true for Hertl. There isn't that point per game pace, and watching him with the eye test, you're not even necessarily surprised that he's not keeping up a point per game pace. I can count on 2 hands the amount of games that Hertl has been fully engaged in this past season, and most of the other games he's been essentially going through the motions. And even though he is a very good player, and so going through the motions for him is still better than majority of the rest of the Sharks team, it still makes it a very disappointing thing to watch when a player who you know can be exceptionally good, like I mentioned, back in 18-19, he was the Sharks' best forward among some really, really strong players. The fact that you're now watching him just sort of be there, be skating, be okay player is rather disappointing for sure. And you can take a look also at his plus minus, which is a stat that I have constantly criticized recently when going through these player reviews as saying, oh, well, the Sharks, they give up so many goals with an empty net, and that counts as a minus, plus the fact that they're a really, really bad team. But I mean, Hertl led the team, or I guess is dead last on the team depending on how you look at it, with the lowest plus minus out of every single player with this minus 36. In fact, he is the 4th worst plus minus in the entire league. And so yes, there are some defenses that you can give that I have given in the past to other players, but eventually you do kind of have to turn this around. But Hertl found himself on the ice for so many goals against, which is quite crazy because, like I said, Timo Meier, who had a significantly better stat than this, Hertl found himself playing with Meier for about 60% of his total even strength ice time. And it should be noted that, remember, Meier wasn't here for the last quarter of the year, which means about 25% of Hertl's even strength ice time literally could not be played with Timo Meier, meaning the vast majority of the time that Meier was here, Hertl was playing with him, and yet still ended up with a pretty ugly plus minus and a just general level of play that wasn't really up to par. When it comes to his time on ice, I would say the most interesting part of this is not actually the exact amount, 19 minutes, 17 seconds. That is to be expected from like a first-line center. But looking a bit deeper into this, there is a big deviation in terms of shorthanded ice time. Now, usually Hertl has been a pretty big forward for the San Jose Sharks when it comes to playing shorthanded. A lot of the times, the Sharks would go with a duo of Couture and Hertl in the past to try and kill penalties, especially ones that they really wanted to get killed off. But this season has been a massive departure from that, as Hertl has gone from an average of around 1 minute and 30 seconds of shorthanded ice time in each of the past 4 seasons to this year having just about 13 seconds of shorthanded ice time per game. Now, I'm not exactly sure why the reasoning for that is, whether that is a David Quinn thing where he doesn't want Hertl playing shorthanded, or he doesn't think Hertl should be playing shorthanded, or if it is a Hertl thing where he doesn't want to be playing shorthanded. But it is a pretty interesting change for sure, and maybe has something to do with the lowered performance generally. Maybe this was indeed a coaching decision. But as we move on to the grades, last season I was very, very lenient when it came to Hertl. I mentioned how even though he wasn't necessarily playing great from an eye test point of view, the point total was still there, and as such I gave him a B+. I am not going to be nearly as lenient this season. The fact is, even though the point total is still pretty solid, I feel as though it is carried by a couple of the other really strong performances from other Sharks Sharks players this season, and from just watching Tomas Hertl the entirety of the year, he just is a shadow of the player he was just a few years ago, and it is quite disappointing to see, especially on the first year of a massive contract that he got signed last season. You were thinking he might be able to turn it around with less of the pressure on him, and yet, even with very little sort of pressure there, he still is putting up a lackluster performance. Class dismissed.